Just a little bit about myself. Hey, I'm the founder of AI Governance International, which is the nonprofit organization, and had been founded last summer. We are running right now global online events, and we're planning on to expand our work in research and so on. I'm also the independent consultant on AI governance, policy and ethics, based in Germany, but right now during the pandemic time, basically working almost around the world in terms of consulting. So today I will talk about the introduction to AI and data ethics, and then I will focus on specifically on one topic, which will be bias, which is one of the most important topics. I will try to expand my screen right now. So yeah, just probably most of the presentations about artificial intelligence starts with a definition of artificial intelligence, but unfortunately we do not have yet agreed upon term how to define artificial intelligence, because the most difficult term comes with the intelligence. We don't really know what it is. Basically, it is understood as something, the technology that kind of replicates the human intelligence, the decision-making capabilities, the senses that we have, vision, speech recognition, and so on. And here is the Investopedia definition of this, which I kind of do not quite agree. And one of the basic topics that we have right now and why we're talking about ethics is exactly like, why should we care about it? Just because we define artificial intelligence as something that sometimes is supposed to replace the human decision-making and replace the human intelligence in some of the tasks, then we should be also concerned about its ethics, about its decision-making capabilities, and about its morals or values, and whether it is aligned to human capabilities, decision-makings, and values. The alignment is one of the most important problems when it comes to AI ethics. So where does the ethics matters? Mostly this goes to data ethics, algorithmic ethics, and usage ethics. We'll go through some of the details about each part. So when it comes to data ethics, we basically have major questions that comes in research, in corporate policies, in government policies that is emerging. In the last 2-3 years, there is more and more talk about the AI ethics, regulatory frameworks, policy frameworks, governance frameworks, and so on. So these are basically the terms that we see mostly in those frameworks and guidelines. So informed consent, that is about the user, that knowing that their data used, how their data is analyzed, how their data is used. Then comes privacy. This is a quite easier term that most of the people are quite aware of. Privacy of the users. I will not expand on that. Then comes one of the most important questions, bias, that goes also under the algorithmic ethics, but for the data ethics, basically that comes under the question whether the data itself that is used for the training for algorithms contains the bias. For example, the gender bias, racial bias, some nationalistic characteristics, or any other features or characteristics that is usual for the human bias and decision making. So usually the data that is usually used for machine learning training, then it is transferred to the algorithms, and then the outcome is exactly based on the bias. And in most of the times, the data scientists and the developers are not really aware of the existing bias, and they do not really address this problem, while feature engineering or data cleaning and so on in the data science processes or machine learning development processes, which happens usually. And then we have also some major questions that all the companies or data scientists and machine learning developers need to ask themselves. For example, how data is labeled, and by whom, and what kind of bias might include in the data, how to document and notify users about how their data is used, also how to document the data used for the algorithm training, and so that then you have one of the most important concepts, that is informed consent, so that the users know what's happening in the decision-making process. And then also comes data accuracy. like bias in the data is one thing, but data accuracy is another thing. Whether the data is representative of the group or of the case that you really want to describe and that you really want to predict from your algorithmic outcome. Also data ownership, who owns the data, whether there is a third party involved in the data science or algorithmic decision-making processes, also whether it is owned by the corporate parties or by the government, whether there is a threat that the data might be used for authoritative purposes, that you might have heard of the cases of China, for example. And we have also the transparency term, which is quite disputed term. I recently also wrote the blog about the transparency and explainability. Usually transparency is understood as something that that making algorithms and processes that go beyond algorithm to be transparent for various stakeholders, such as like auditors, government representatives, or even users. Then comes explainability, which is basically the explainability of the algorithm itself, that black box problem, well-known problem that we have, but we go for that in algorithmic ethics. So it's very hard to explain all this in details in very such a short amount of time. But basically, the data ethics goes to all the questions that that is about basically the very easy thing that is about data and what kind of data you have, whether the data is really valuable that you need, whether the data is serves the purpose that you want to do with your algorithm and the outcome and the decision that it makes, and what kind of features or labels you're working with as a data scientist or machine learning developer. Then we have algorithmic ethics, and here usually we have the questions that goes around security and safety, which is also like sometimes labeled as the robustness of the algorithms. Like once again, these are the terms that in most of the there are probably like hundreds of guidelines so far already, and in most of the guidelines there is probably no single term that is the same, that comes with the same explanation in all the guidelines and regulatory frameworks or policy frameworks around. So basically the security and safety, and sometimes it is also referred to as robustness, is about algorithmic robustness and its sustainability, that it can stay aligned to its purpose and it doesn't deviate from its purpose, and it's kind of obeys to its developer and doesn't change the feature. Also, the safety goes around the algorithms and has to be safe in terms of physical, in the physical real world, and also for the mental health when it comes to, for example, in robotics. Usually the software, which is AI software, which is used for robotics, such as autonomous driving cars, such as robots that are used in manufacturing, for example, and even drones or many other uses. Then we have explainability as well that I have mentioned already, that refers to the black box and the difficulty of the machine, of the algorithmic decision to be explained to in a human understandable way. This one thing is whether it is explainable or not, and another is whether it is interpretable or not in a human understandable way. Then we have transparency. Once again, in algorithmic transparency, it is very important. For example, in smart cities, when you have to justify, when the companies or smart city authorities have to justify their decisions about the algorithmic outcomes, and have to make their citizens informed. Trust is another very important issue that is about making AI technologies trustworthy in terms of for the users, for the citizens as such, so that they use these technologies. For example, if there's no trust in autonomous driving cars, in driverless cars, there will not be people who are buying that. Also in healthcare as well, there will not be trust in the diagnostic technology solutions when the doctors are using for diagnosis for the patients. Then comes responsibility and accountability, which is another very important question. For example, like in a team where where people work on different solutions, who is responsible, for example, who if something goes wrong. And we have so many examples when something went wrong. And we also had examples when the manager of the project has resigned. I will talk about it, about the examples a little bit later. Also accountability. So the major difference between responsibility and accountability is that for responsibility, you have to justify your actions. And for accountability, you have to justify also explanations like why you did it, so that you are also accountable to the users, to the people, to the government officials, and to anyone, even the auditors or regulators, any stakeholders that is interested in that. And we have also usage ethics. For these terms, very useful example is, for example, the healthcare, where the doctors use AI-powered machines for the diagnosis. And we have here some of the terms that are interesting. For example, errors of omission and errors of commission. Sometimes doctors might, for example, put too much trust into the AI machine, and then they might undermine their own assessment of the diagnosis, and they might trust machine too much. So even if there is a lot of proofs that the machine is wrong, so sometimes doctors trust the machines even if they should not. And then we have also the major questions that comes here. Is that what skills are needed to decide whether to use and how to use AI tools? What are user risks and what level of human oversight is necessary? How should doctor decide whether and how to use the machine, when to trust himself or herself, and when to trust machine? And what processes are needed to be implemented for a short-term and long-term impact assessments on a patient, or like in general for other AI solutions as well. And also we have very important question, the question of liability. For example, if something goes wrong in terms for the machine, and any kind of machine, any kind of AI technology, who is liable for whether take, like, here's another good example, healthcare, or again, autonomous driving. If, for example, the car crashes someone and kills, who is liable for that? Is it a manufacturer? Is it someone who wrote the software? Is it someone who was sitting in it, who was owning the car, the driverless car, and so on? So these are the questions that are not so far resolved. And codes of conduct in usage ethics is very important as well. And there's already most of the big tech companies are working on codes of conduct, and they have their own responsibility principles, responsible AI. Google, Microsoft, for example, in most of the big tech companies, they have their own responsible AI guidebook or framework, and they're also working with other startup companies, for example, to introduce their guidebooks. So in the usage ethics, there is again, like many more questions how it is used. For example, even if you talk about the Facebook and social media in general, how the founders of the technology are using the whole social media thing, even if the algorithm, even if the data is completely perfect and their work perfect, they're aligned to their purpose, then how it is used when it is already deployed in a real life, in the real world. So then we go to one of the most important questions. I don't know why it says. I get some message, please move this window away. So we have one of the major questions, one of the most unresolved problems that we have, that is bias and fairness question. And most of the times that I have already mentioned, so that there is two basic occasions when bias can emerge. That can emerge from the data itself, which is biased, the historical data, which already contains some human bias, and we have also algorithm, where because algorithm reasons from correlations rather than causations, it cannot differ. It cannot say why or for what the decision was made. Then we have it makes decisions from the correlations. So there is also high chance that the algorithm makes correlations from, like, it makes wrong assumptions, false, some the correlations are not really right, are not really describing the case, the situation, and so on. So basically that goes to the data and algorithmic fairness problems and how to deal with that. So far, a lot of researchers, a lot of companies are working on working out fairness metrics, but one of the difficult question and challenges that basically, first of all, we need to know as humans what is fair for us, like for whom it is fair. There is a lot of cultural differences, for example, across the globe. There's a lot of political differences, there's a lot of personal value differences and so on. So whose fairness is it, whose ethics is it, whose decision, and whose who, according to whose values, basically the fairness metrics are worked out. And here I wanted to bring some examples that are very, very vivid. For example, we have here also for Georgian, it's the same. We do not have gender-specific pronouns, right? Hungarian is the same. This is from the research from last year, 2020. I tried for Georgian, it already translated only for the male, like he is for everything. But here is very obvious how the gender bias works from the data. For example, from Hungarian to English, she's a nurse, he's a scientist, he's an engineer. So basically, it already depicted all the bias that we have about the gender-specific professions or occupations. We all see he's a teacher, she's a reading organizer, and he's a CEO. And here are other examples or clashes or escalations that have happened around the bias as well. I don't know if you have heard already. If you're looking at some of these major questions, probably you have already heard of these cases, because this has been very, very much escalated in the last months, from the last year. So this has been basically the A-level algorithm in UK, where the students were discriminated. So basically, just like I will just bring the case of Georgia, because I think the most of the attendees are from Georgia. So just like we have the exams after the school and we enter the university, similar like in UK after the school, because of the pandemic, the schools were unable to actually hold these exams. So they decided to build the algorithm that would predict what kind of what kind of mark the student would get from the exam based on their previous historical studies. So basically, this algorithm has discriminated against the poor regions, vulnerable regions, where children in public schools were, and was prioritizing in their marks for the richer regions or richer peoples, or for the private schools. And then it led to a lot of protests in UK, and even until now, this question is very much circulating around the globe about how the algorithm has discriminated the poor, a little bit poorer people, children around the world. Then we had also the Amazon's case, when Amazon's algorithm has discriminated against the women for the technical jobs. This algorithm was definitely then ditched, was not used again. Then we also have George Floyd case, where the facial recognition system was used for predictive policing, and the police, you maybe have heard, George Floyd was killed by the police, and then it was assumed that the facial recognition system was discriminating against the Black people. It was racial. Basically, here you see accuracy of face recognition system, face recognition technologies, and it basically the accuracy is lowest for the darker females, and is highest for the lighter males, for the white males, basically. And this is the most acute issue for the facial recognition system. And that's why also tech companies such as IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon has declared a moratorium to develop the artificial intelligence facial recognition systems. And they're kind of waiting for regulatory frameworks what to do with it. So just a little bit, like 1 more minute. I know I'm running out of time. Solutions are very intangible so far. There's a lot of companies, including big tech companies or startup companies, that are working on, for example, opening the black box and making it a white box, or to work out the metrics and so on. So we will have, I think Nikita will explain more about the frameworks, the regulatory frameworks. What we have right now as the solutions, including the European Union suggestions for the policy that was introduced in April. And we have basically these questions around the solutions. So thank you very much. I hope you learned a little bit about the AI ethics.